You're moving to New York City and you need to learn about New York City housing. Or you've lived in New York City for years, you've lived here all your life, and you still need to learn about New York City housing. Rent stabilization, rent control, the Good Cause Eviction Law, affordable housing, co-ops, condos, co-living. Welcome to the most confusing, crowded housing landscape in the country. Fortunately, this episode is entitled New York City Housing Types Demystified. New York City tenants have more rights than tenants anywhere else in America, but New York City tenants are also shockingly uneducated about what those rights are. A right you don't know you have is the same as no right at all, and there are so many bits of incomplete information out there. This podcast will change all that. In each episode, we look at current legal cases and statutes and the real-life apartment stories they give rise to here in the greatest city on earth. And every episode ends with a tenant takeaway, so you have actionable information to help you make better choices. The law belongs to you, New York City, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I'm Michelle Itkowitz, and this is Learn to Live Better, a housing law podcast. Okay, so there are 2.6 million units of rental housing in New York City, 2.6 million apartments. By the way, I'm getting my data today mostly from the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I made you a chart. Don't worry if you're not watching. I'll never do a podcast that you have to have a visual. But if you are watching, I made you a pie chart. That 2.6 can be broken down broadly into two large categories. This is what people really need to know. 700,000 of those units of housing are free market, and 1.9 million of those units of housing are what I call, this is a term I made up, forever rental homes. Forever homes, but they're rental apartments. What do I mean by that? A forever home is an apartment that you can only be evicted from if you fail to pay the rent or if you break the rules of the tenancy. And generally, with forever homes, there is some kind of government suppression of the rent level so that the rent isn't just at the market level. A forever home is more affordable and you can only be evicted for certain causes. It could be a home that you stay in forever. All right, so let's start by talking about the free market apartments because that's what people are going to be most familiar with. All right, in a free market apartment, upon renewal, the landlord's able to raise the rent as much as it wants to. And if the tenant doesn't agree to the proposed rent increase, then the landlord can freely evict the tenant. Now, I just want to be a little careful here. That doesn't mean that there are not lots of protections in place for all New York City tenants. For example, a tenant could never be evicted for a discriminatory reason because they're in a certain category. Also, there are certain notice requirements in place if a landlord wants to terminate a tenancy or raise the rent more than 5%. Also, a landlord cannot attempt to evict a tenant who has paid the rent just because the tenant has made a complaint about repairs. There are certain checks and notices in place that will pump the brakes on an eviction. But none of that converts a free market apartment into a forever rental home. So let's start talking about forever rental homes. I'm going to start with two categories that are smaller. Together they make up 500,000 apartments. We're going to start with co-ops. All right, the first thing I want to do is distinguish between co-ops and condos. These are two terms that people conflate all the time. A condominium apartment is just like a house. It's a piece of real property that you would buy. You would get a deed for a condo. That's not something we're ever going to be concerned with here because we're concerned with rental housing. Co-ops, however, are rental housing. And this is where people get confused. They sometimes say, wait a minute, I didn't think co-ops were rental housing. I thought you bought a co-op. Yes and no. When you buy a co-op, what you're really doing is you're buying shares in a corporation that owns the building. And the building then issues you a long-term lease, a 99-year lease. That's why this is a form of forever rental housing. Now, you can take a bank loan to buy the shares, and sometimes people get confused and think that's a mortgage. It's not really a mortgage, it's a security interest, and you have to be generally approved by the co-op board before you can buy a co-op. And there are 310,000 co-ops in New York City. The thing with co-ops, though, is there's no government suppression of the rent level. And a co-op, your rent is really determined because you're paying a share of your building's operating costs. But again, I just want co-ops to be on people's radar because you might be subletting from a co-op shareholder. And there, the thing I really want you to walk away with is knowing that usually for co-op sublets, the subtenant needs board approval. And I see this happen a lot. A lot of times people don't seek that out before they put their subtenant in. And then that can be troublesome for you in the future as a subtenant of a co-op shareholder. So if you're going to sublet a co-op, always ask the shareholder if they need board approval or if you can obtain board approval. Another type of housing that's forever home is needs-based housing. Needs-based housing are apartments that one must qualify for based on one's income and assets being below a certain threshold. And once a tenant is admitted to this type of housing, the laws generally require that the tenant be perpetually renewed as long as the tenant pays the rent, doesn't violate the terms of the tenancy, and income recertifies. The rent is always kept very low by certain formulas because the whole point of needs-based housing is to provide affordable housing for people to make their homes in. What you should know about this is there are very long waiting lists for this type of housing, and there is a lot of paperwork to fill out to get into it. So you could just Google this. You can start on a New York City website portal, and it will take you through that. But neither of these housing modalities are things you can slip right into. It takes a minute to buy a co-op, and it takes a minute to get admitted to needs-based housing. Let's move on to the big categories of forever homes that are much more accessible to most people. Rent stabilization is our big player at somewhere between 900,000 and 1 million units. Okay, rent stabilization. It started in the 1970s. Once a tenant's admitted to a rent-stabilized apartment, the law requires that such tenancy be renewed by the landlord as long as the tenant pays the rent and follows the rules of the tenancy. Now, you notice I didn't say here, and as long as the tenant income recertifies, as I did with needs-based housing, and that's because rent stabilization is not needs-based. You could be a billionaire and live in a rent-stabilized apartment, and I've actually seen that. Not needs-based. Anybody can live in a rent-stabilized apartment. Now, if you're rent stabilized, it means that your rent can only go up by small annual percentage increases that are decided by the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. Different people get appointed to this board, and they come up with these increments every year. And these increments are always way below what jump ups would be in regular market rate apartments. And the longer you're there, the more the gulf grows between what you're paying and what the market would be paying, because it's perpetually lower percentages that rent increases are going up by. So the current renewal rates authorized by the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, effective from October 1st, 2025, going through September 30th, 2026, are 3% for a one-year lease and 4.5% for a two-year lease. And that's the other thing. You as the tenant get to choose if you're going to renew for 1 year or for 2 years. The landlord doesn't decide that. You get to pick which one you want. A big unique feature of rent stabilization that's not talked about enough is that rent stabilized tenants have a whole extra way for enforcing their housing rights. In the free market, if you don't like what your landlord did, you could sue your landlord, which costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time, or you could stop paying your rent and then your landlord would sue you and you end up in housing court and you could fight out your dispute with the landlord there. But I've never liked that as an option for tenants, because if you're the aggrieved party, but you stop paying and get sued, now it looks like you're someone who doesn't pay your rent, which could have implications for you in other parts of your life. In rent stabilization, tenants have an agency, a New York State agency called the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, the DHCR. And rent-stabilized tenants are allowed to bring certain types of cases in this quasi-judicial arm of DHCR. So if you have a grievance against your landlord, you can bring it there, certain types of cases. And you don't have to go there. It's all done through the mails. And you don't have to pay a fee for these cases. And DHCR has a great deal of expertise about rent stabilization. It's not perfect. It takes a long time, but it's a good option. Also a big unique feature of rent stabilization, and you'll also see this in needs-based housing typically, is that a family member who has resided with you for a certain amount of time, or someone who's in a family-like relationship with you, who resides with you for a certain amount of time before you vacate the apartment, might be able to do what we call succeed to the apartment. It's a fancy word for inherit the apartment. Your family can literally inherit your rent-stabilized tenancy under certain circumstances. I have a case right now where I'm trying to save a rent-stabilized apartment for a couple in their 50s. And one of them was born in the apartment. That person's father moved into the apartment in 1969. I'm born in 1967, and I just think it's wild that I am litigating at 58 years old about an apartment that the family moved into when I was 2. I mean, that's rent stabilization. And they have a teenage child. So if I can save this apartment, this is a tenancy that now spans 56 years and 3 generations. That's the power of rent stabilization. By the way, before we go off of rent stabilization, there is another rent regulatory system called rent control. This is another thing that people always conflate, like condo co-op. So a lot of people mix up rent control, rent stabilization. Rent control was another housing system that ended, I believe, in the late 60s. And as rent control tenants leave their apartments, rent control goes away with them. Those apartments either go into the free market or rent stabilization, depending on a bunch of factors. But rent control's just been going away over the years. And at this point, I think there's like 24,000 rent control apartments. And you're not going to rent one because, I mean, I suppose if you move in with your grandmother, maybe you could succeed to it. But other than that, rent control's not really on the radar anymore. All right, so now here's the thing. Enter stage right, a whole new system of rent regulation called the Good Cause Eviction Law. In April of 2024, we got the Good Cause Eviction Law, the biggest change in housing since we got rent stabilization in 1974. The easiest way maybe to think about this is this. Rent stabilization and good cause eviction, they end up largely in the same places. Your tenancy has to be renewed unless you're not paying the rent or breaking the rules. Neither are needs-based, and both have artificial caps on the rent. The rent can only go up so much in both systems. The thing is, however, they approach getting to that place from completely different angles. It's like they both meet at the top of the mountain, but one goes up one side of the mountain and one goes up the other. Here's another thing that's funny about good cause eviction a year and a half into it. There's no real reliable statistic, apparently, of how many apartments are covered by good cause eviction. I found an April 17th, 2024 city limits article that had some methodology for estimating how many that sounded good to me. They're estimating that 400,000 apartments are covered by the Good Cause Eviction Law. One good thing about good cause eviction that is better than rent stabilization, and this is really the only thing you're going to hear me say about good cause that's better than rent stabilization, is that the landlord is required to give you a notice on every lease renewal or every court document letting you know your status as yes or no, a good cause eviction apartment. And if the answer is no, they're required to explain why. That's a very good aspect of good cause eviction that does not exist in rent stabilization, which is a story for another day. So the rent increases on good cause eviction. They are limited, and they are limited by a formula that has to do with a change in the consumer price index plus 5%. Don't check out on me on that one. I can't stand this either. I have never had to think about the consumer price index, and I could care if I ever had to think about the consumer price index. Fortunately, you don't really have to think about the consumer price index, because the thing is, the calculation is done for you and it's published. It's published by the agency I mentioned earlier, the DHCR. So you could just Google it and you can always find what the good cause eviction rent percentage increase threshold is. Right now, as I record this, it's 8.79%. Now, no, think about that. It's almost 9%. What did I just say the rent stabilization increases were? For a 1-year lease, 3%. And for a 2-year lease, 4.5%. That's very different than 9%. But actually, there's more. Because under good cause eviction, there's also a very big loophole written into the statute whereby the landlord can attempt to raise the rent beyond that threshold based on certain costs that are enumerated in the statute. We're just going to need more case law on this to see how this is working. But your rent is not going to stay as stable in good cause eviction as it does in rent stabilization, at least not at this point. Also, the good cause eviction law lacks a provision giving good cause eviction law tenants access to an agency like DHCR to litigate in an easy forum for disputes with their landlord. So right now it looks like with good cause eviction, if there's a fight between a landlord and tenant, it has to take place in the court system, and that's unfortunate. Also, good cause eviction does not have a succession option. It's not like families can inherit good cause eviction law apartments from each other. That's just not what this statute is. All right, so now we're going to backtrack just for a second back to free market, and we're going to talk about something called co-living. Co-living is a subset of free market housing, but it's growing fast and it's very innovative and it's important, and we have to talk about it. Co-living is an arrangement by which a landlord rents an apartment to a group of tenants for at least 30 days. This is not short-term renting, where the tenants occupy and share the apartment. It's all about roommates in co-living. And this is an arrangement that the landlord participates in and facilitates. The tenants have flexible terms in co-living, and this really differentiates it from regular free market housing. In general, landlords don't like it when you make a lease and break it. But in co-living, it's set up so you can break your lease. That is allowed. You can give a certain notice and break your lease early. Flexibility is a big advantage for tenants in co-living. And if a roommate does do that, if a roommate breaks the lease, then you as tenants don't have to go out and find a replacement. The landlord agrees in the lease that it will help you find a roommate. This makes a lot of sense to me because landlords are in a much better position to aggregate roommates than tenants are. You only have your own personal network. But a landlord is in the housing business. They have brokers, they have advertisements. The landlord will go out and try to find you a new roomie. While the landlord is looking for the roommate in co-living, the landlord will also offer the tenants, it's built right into the lease, rent relief so that they don't have to make up the share that roommate was paying. And they'll give you that break unless and until they try to offer you a new roommate. And if you reject that roommate, then at that point they'll say, okay, you don't have to take the roommate, but the lease is going to require you to pay all the rent. You're not going to get that special abatement. And co-living, the apartments are typically furnished, and that's another nice thing. And there's also other amenities. Sometimes there's cleaning. There's a lot of emphasis on community in co-living. They'll have maybe thematic programming, a potluck dinner, speakers, a barbecue in the yard. The advantages of co-living for tenants are affordability, flexibility, convenience, limited liability for bad roommates, and community. And the advantage of co-living for the landlord is they're getting a higher price per square foot for all of this. So the actual roommates are paying less, but as an aggregate, the landlord's getting more for the apartment than they would in a regular free market setting. It's controversial because there are bad co-living operators out there that are not doing co-living at all. They're just people renting rooms in regular apartments, which is highly illegal. You cannot rent an individual room in a New York City apartment. That is a no-no. It's illegal, and it's also extremely dangerous. It could be a fire hazard. Someone could get hurt. If you're out looking at co-living, try to go with the more reputable companies that have a track record. And also just make sure you're renting an apartment. You're not renting a room. And also use common sense. Always look around. Make sure, is this apartment too crowded? Do I have egress and ingress? Can I get in and out in a fire? God forbid. Those are some things to keep in mind in co-living. All right, so let's sum this up with another pie chart that you don't need to look at. Free market apartments, 700,000. Rent stabilization, 984,000. Good cause eviction coming in at 400,000. Needs-based, 220,000. Co-ops, 310,000. And co-living, I have no idea. I estimated on my chart 20,000 apartments. I could be wrong by a factor of 10. Co-living is really growing. And it's important because it addresses the affordability crisis in New York. All right, we are going to do some tenant takeaways, but before we do that, this is not legal advice. I am not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If it's legal advertising, it's just terrible because I'm asking you not to contact me. This podcast is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is just the podcast that I always wanted to make. What I would like to hear from you on is what topics do you want to hear more about? I have the email in the show notes. It is time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. If you're new to New York, and even if you're not new to New York, co-ops and needs-based housing are forms of housing that are forever homes. They're forever homes, but they both take a lot of time to get into. You don't just slide into owning a co-op. You don't just slide into an affordable housing situation. There's application procedures. Again, co-ops I really want to have on your radar because you might come and sublet one. And in that case, really, your crucial question is, did the board approve this sublet? Do they have to approve the sublet? Because you don't want the board to start coming down on the shareholder who all of a sudden tells you that you have to get out. The takeaway, I think, is rent stabilization beats the good cause eviction law right now anyway. I have a case I'm involved in right now. And the tenants are good cause eviction law tenants, no doubt, good cause eviction all the way. But the tenants nevertheless are suing the landlord, fighting, saying that the landlord wrongly deregulated the apartment and it really should be a rent stabilized apartment. They're fighting for rent stabilization even though they have good cause eviction because rent stabilization beats good cause eviction. However, good cause eviction beats the free market because we're in the worst housing crisis we've been in since 1968. There's a 1.4% vacancy rate. And I mean, you don't really need numbers. You can feel it. The rents are high. The availability is low. That's why something like co-living being on your radar, I think, is important. And we should really look at all of these different housing modalities. This episode was a little different because it wasn't about a new case or a new law. But I thought we had to cover this because these are the questions that people have for me all the time, and it also makes it easier for me to cover topics that have to do with any of these different types of housing. Rent stabilization, good cause eviction law, co-ops, co-living, whatever it is. I can refer back to this episode if people want an overview of how that particular type of housing fits into the overall picture of the New York City housing landscape. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you. But your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is Learn to Live Better, a housing law podcast.